Hello, and welcome to the Gnosis and Science podcast, Ep.2. In this episode, I will be covering the general line of thought that I've developed while combining science, religion, psychology, theology, philosophy, and various spiritual practices to come up with a almost unified theory of consciousness and drawing parallels between these seemingly disparate modalities and worldviews. Everything acts as a mirror to everything else. This will generate a type of fractal pattern. It's a pattern that expresses itself across different scales, with each part of the pattern containing all other expressions of it within itself. So this is how our universe operates with fractals, and also how consciousness operates. The finite expressing the infinite, the microcosm and the macrocosm. We can see this expressed through the qualitative, subjective experience, often through things like poems. So, Auguries of Innocence by William Blake. To see a world in a grain of sand, and heaven in a wildflower, to hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Or William Wordsworth, a motion and a spirit that implies all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and all rolls through all things. Or Nature by Ralph Waldo Emerson. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am a part or particle of God. This is the individual as a localized expression of the entire pattern of God. Or this quote from the Aleph. I saw the Aleph from every point. I saw the earth in the Aleph. Here, Jorg Louis Borges is describing a single point in space that contains all other points. The Aleph is a singularity of total information. And also, in a more Eastern sense, with the great sage Rumi, you are not a drop in the ocean, you are the entire ocean in a drop. This is similar to the Bodhisattva Thich Nhat Hanh's idea of the wave not being separate from the ocean. And we can see this same fractal mirrored concept in spiritual traditions such as Indra's net from Mahayana Buddhism, which is a net that is said to exist in Indra's palace, Indra being the king of the gods or devas, with each intersection of this net said to contain jewels that will reflect all other jewels in the net. Each reflection contains all other reflections. A good facsimile of this, for frame of reference, would be something like a spider web that is covered in dew or raindrops, as well as the popular expression from Kabbalah, which is ancient Jewish and Christian mysticism: as above, so below, as within, so without, pointing to the fact that our world, or higher realities such as heaven and lower ones such as hell, along with our external reality, mirror our own subjective experience, which is based on our conscious will and subconscious patterns that we repeat until they are brought into conscious awareness. Again, a similar concept to co-arising from Buddhism. Now, to slightly understand this at a larger metaphysical macro scale, we need to look at Plato's theory of forms. Now, he postulates that everything in our reality gets its inherent form and expression from a higher reality version. So, for example, let's say you have two craftsmen, and you ask them to make you the perfect chair based on their own subjective personal interpretation of what perfection is. They will make you two different chairs, and they're both going to be high quality, but they will be distinct. But you can still recognize that these two things are chairs. Now, chairs get their inherent form from the higher reality, or higher dimensional, or more accurate, higher density, which I'll get to in a later episode. A higher density, higher reality version of a chair would be something like the throne of a deity in mythology, or the lotus, or the throne of God from Buddhism or Christianity. So think of it like there's multiple layers of these different realities, kind of like a pyramid. We would be at the base of the pyramid with our everyday physical objects. And then the next step or rung of the pyramid, you would have something like the world of the gods from Norse mythology, or Olympus. And up above that, you would have higher realities. This is known as lokas in Hinduism, eventually reaching the point where there are no longer just objects, but the embodiments of ideas, like the virtues. So with the angels, they are the first fractal split of consciousness, of God consciousness. And it's not that, let's say, the angel Raphael is very good at expressing love. It's that Archangel Raphael is a embodied expression of the unconditional love of God. And then once you get to the pinnacle, that is God, that is the good, that is the divine. And as consciousness and the light of God descends from one layer to the next, it will actually split, like light going through a prism. It splits into a smaller scale expression. And as this descent happens, consciousness, the soul, forgets, and it starts to identify with the body and the mind and the thoughts as the self, rather than the soul, the observer itself. And this is what gives rise to dualistic thinking, the separation of self and other, inside, outside, good, bad, conscious, and subconscious. This is what it means in the Bible when it says, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." If, let's say, for example, you go to church and you see someone wearing shabby clothes because maybe they can't afford it or something, point is they're not in what you would consider Sunday best, then that means that when you are judging someone for whatever it is they're wearing or driving or any sort of judgment, you are actually saying to yourself subconsciously, unless I meet that standard that I'm holding this other person to, I am unworthy of love. So that is you pridefully placing a condition on the unconditional love of God. Of course, this works in the reverse as well. Just flip the pyramid upside down. If there's a good, there is also a bad. So as the light of God, or of individual consciousness, coalesces together, as it descends down this pyramid due to a lack of understanding and identification with the I in an egoic sense, then you are essentially being consumed by what are known as demons, even though that term is very charged, and I feel like it gives a lot more power than is actually necessary, and it is actually counterproductive to the whole process. But this eventually culminates in the adversary, whatever you want to label that as, be that the devil, Satan, Mara. It is the aspect of consciousness that sees itself is fully separate from all that is. And we can see this multi-layered idea of different worlds in Buddhism, Hinduism, and also a little bit in Christianity. It's just that they're referred to differently in each of these traditions. So in Hinduism, we can see that there are different tiers of deities, with each of these realities operating at a different rates of time. Particularly in Hindu deities, so there's Brahma, the creator of this universe, said to exist for 100 Brahma years, so from his perspective, just a normal lifetime. But from our perspective, it's 311.24 trillion human years. While Vishnu, much higher along the growth path of the soul, essentially, lives for 700 divine years, or 700 years. And then from our perspective, that's 2.17 quadrillion years. Then there's also Christianity, where in different, some canon, some non-canon texts, they refer to a stratified system of heaven, or noting the difference in how God perceives time from a non-linear perspective. For 1,000 years in your sight are but yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. Along with many other quotes, these allude to the difference in perception as you increase in scale of awareness. With these different layers of reality, along with our sense of time being directly tied to our understanding of self in relation to the other. Our conscious awareness is what creates the object-observer phenomenon, and this separation that seems to dissolve as we increase our level of understanding of self and the evolution of the soul. So now that we've looked at this through the human artistic experience as well as religious experience, how do we tie this into science, besides just looking at a Mandelbrot set and going, oh, hey, look there, see, and pointing? That's not going to work. So everything is a pattern of everything else. Following this logic, we should be able to look at the rules that we can observe, and quantify through science, like the laws of physics, and apply the same rules that govern this expression of pattern to a larger metaphysical framework. First, we need to look at a specific type of string theory called ADS-CFT string theory. The ADS stands for anti-de Sitter space. This is referring to the anti-curvature space, so think the inside of a ball. And the CFT means conformal field theory. This just means that no matter what scale you are viewing a system from, a similar pattern will emerge as the rules, like the laws of physics, that govern this pattern remain the same. Originally, this theory came about as physicists were trying to answer the question, what happens to information that, or matter, because they're the same thing, that falls within a black hole past its event horizon? It can't be destroyed, as that would break the laws of physics. So eventually, it was theorized that it was preserved along the event horizon within a 2D format. This theory was proposed by Juan Maldacena in 1997. It established a holographic duality between quantum gravity and this anti-de Sitter space and conformal field theories. Put simply, everything that is happening in a space with gravity can be described as a theory living on its edge with one less dimension, where our 3D slash 4D, which is just space plus time, reality might be like a hologram, where the inside is completely encoded on this anti-curved surface. So think of a character experiencing a full 3D world, but everything is actually a projection onto a 2D screen, giving the illusion of movement and depth, with gravity or the warping of space-time arising as a byproduct of the interaction. Now, Maldacena has proposed that there are what are known as two-dimensional objects known as branes. That's BRANES. These are overlapping grids. They're very close together. And there is what is known as a scale invariant spatial axis that runs through them. So depending on where you are along this spatial axis, there would be a numerical value associated with that position, or a different change in scale of expression. So lower along the spatial axis, you are smaller, and then higher, you are larger. This spatial axis runs through all of these brain-like structures, these different grids. And these grids act as the start and end points of strings. These multi-dimensional strings are connected by gluon strands, and the string length is representative of the energy within that bond. I noticed that this is very similar to the strings of fate and mythology, but also cord cutting ceremonies in certain spiritual practices. It is simply a purposeful guided meditation to cut energetic cords. This is essentially you getting rid of certain connections or subconscious thought patterns or lines of thought that keep you bound, repeating patterns. And these gluon strands are also what keep objects along this scale invariant axis stuck at certain points, so they can't ascend past a certain level until this bond is broken and these cords are cut. So as we bring subconscious patterns that arise from trauma into conscious awareness, this allows us to more authentically express ourselves, as we are no longer identifying with that former past version of us, because we are no longer defining our sense of self by that trauma. So if you are, for example, working a job that you hate, but it brings in the money, and you're wondering why you're unhappy, then you have, at some point, again, not looking at your responsibility or circumstances to each their own, they're all specific and individual, but at some point you have convinced yourself, this is what I need to do to make money and get by, versus that dream your inner child had, which might be being an artist or a musician or a voice actor or a writer. Another interesting thing worth noting, which I'll get to in the next episode, is that when The string length, which represents the energy and the bond, when it is expressed as a separate dimension, you get the wave equation of a graviton. This is the theorized particle responsible for gravity. But again, I'll touch on the implications of that in the next episode. They also found that these lower and high, and there are also higher dimensional objects, will actually oscillate between solvable and insolvable states. Now, these objects aren't just objects in the sense of a lamp is an object, or a table, or a chair, or a car, but consciousness itself. From your perspective, I am the object, and you are the observer, and then vice versa. From my perspective, I am the observer, and you are the object. When these objects oscillate between solvable and insoluble states, it's like a pattern being able to be examined when it's in a solvable state, and then it's very closely linked together and it's not able to be examined when it's in an insolvable state. It's like that sphere that you throw up in the air and it expands, and then when it comes back down it contracts. The Hoberman sphere. It's the little fun little ball thing you throw up in the air. If expressions of consciousness are these objects, then that would mean that the higher reality form that everything in our reality gets its inherent form from, that we would call a deity or a deva, and we interpret as a representation of like a subconscious archetype. At some point, they will be in a solvable state, and we will be in a insolvable state. This would correspond astrologically to whatever planet is, and whatever planet is that we associate with that specific archetype. Let's say the higher dimensional object is in a highly coupled state, while we are in a highly solvable state. That means that that planet would be in retrograde. So it's not so-and-so planet is causing me to have, problems communicating or taking action or something. It's that the solar system itself acts as a type of metronome or a mirror or a clock to show me what archetypal energies I am processing on a subconscious level at any given time, especially depending on your birth chart and stuff. This oscillation of information between higher and lower realities is what is being referred to in Dr. Sheldrake's morphic field theory. He had theorized that there were morphic fields that were not subject to time or space as we know it, that have an influence on the way that certain, be it formations of crystals, to animal behavior, to even thoughts and ideas, are expressed and form in our reality. He was just noticing the same thing that Plato was trying to articulate years and years and years ago, is that it is the transfer of information. And he had noticed this with a set of rats. So there were a group of rats in a lab that learned a skill, and then separated by hundreds of miles, another group of rats had to learn the same skill, but they learned it at a faster rate. So essentially, the higher form or high reality version of a rat that all rats in our reality get their inherent form from, learned the skill and integrated it from the subconscious into conscious awareness. And because these higher realities are not subject to linear time as we would understand it, then the second group of rats essentially had to play catch up to then match this higher reality expression of a rat. So this scale invariant spatial axis that runs through all realities, both our physical ones and then also the immaterial or spiritual. These higher realities are planes of conceptualized thought and idea, be that positive or negative expression, good and bad, heaven or hell. And we can see this concept mirrored in the laws of physics with what is known as the Brachistochrone problem, or the angle or curve of fastest descent. Now, this was formalized by Leonard Euler in the early to mid 1700s, even though it was shown through many other physicists before, but he was the one to actually formalize it. The problem essentially asks, if there's an object falling from point A, a point of pure potential energy, so let's say the object is like at the top of a hill, like a ball, to point B, the point of fully expended kinetic energy, what is the optimal slope to get that object from point A to B in the least amount of time with the least amount of energy actually expended? So it's a universal optimizing principle. So in order to find this path, Leonard Euler actually turned this from a mechanics problem with a ball or a particle going down a hill or a slope to light. So just like how light will refract at a certain angle when it goes through water, like let's say you put a straw in a glass of water, it refracts. And this is what's known as Snell's law. Now, they found that when you took this ratio, and I won't go into the math here, but essentially flip it. Think of the denser media on top and then the less dense media below it. Now just take that same idea but stack it so there's a multi-layered cake essentially of the highest density on top and then a little less dense and a little less dense and a little less dense. Now light will take the optimal path, so it will actually start out slower at the highest density, and then once it crosses the boundary to the little less dense reality, it will refract and then it will speed up. So the speed of light isn't actually constant, but is dependent on its distance from the top, from this point of pure potential. And eventually this curve is made because, again, you're taking that ratio of refraction and applying it. And this curve is known as the Todochrone or Brachistochrone curve. And the reason it is called that is because it is what's known as the path of like same time and least time. So the reason it's the same time is because no matter where along this curve, if a mass is released without the influence of gravity, because again, gravity arises as a byproduct of this conformal field theory, then the object will arrive at the end point of fully expended energy at the exact same time, no matter what happens, no matter where it's released along the path. And this is how divine timing works. So certain things won't happen or manifest in your reality until they're meant to happen. because either things need to line up outside or certain subconscious patterns need to be brought into awareness. Everything is always happening as it should be, no matter what choices you make. That's not to say there won't be consequences to actions, but it is a comforting thought. This is also what's known as a cycloid. And a cycloid is the path that is traced by a stationary point along the rim of a spinning wheel, which again is very similar to the yin and yang, the cycle of reincarnation, and all of that. So this scale invariant axis runs through all realities, both our physical and the non-physical, and the soul will, upon death, as it is no longer tied to the physical body to act as an anchor, it will ascend or descend based on its level of understanding of self, or how much good or bad, negative or positive karma it has accrued. Like a ball going from one buoyancy to the next. And we can see this expressed in physics through the UFO principle, or the way that it's the organizing principle for how electrons will orbit the nucleus of an atom based on their charge. So the electron will go up or down in the rings of the orbital depending on its level of charge or energy. But the electron always wants to return to its natural state, its original state. So it will either look to gain more energy or expel energy and go back to its original position. This is mirroring the concept in Buddhism where you can go to the layers of heaven, but unless you've reached nirvana, you're still stuck in the cycle of reincarnation. So you will return back to physical reality to again process more karma until your level of understanding of self increases to where you no longer need to be incarnated. So as you ascend or descend through each layer, time is becoming less and less linear. So time acts as a distributor of space. So the faster that the flow of time, the more spatial axes we have access to, so what scientists call higher dimensions. With the point of pure potential, the good, which is the beginning of all of creation, and then there's the endpoint, the point of fully expended kinetic energy, where there's just no more energy in the system to be used. So at a certain point, the soul can no longer be incarnated as this individual expression of consciousness because there's just no more energy to be put back into the system. It's similar to how in Dante's Inferno, there are souls that are stuck in ice. Well, if the subconscious and also dreams, like when you have a dream, you are essentially experiencing non-linear time, then the subconscious acts as a type of filter to give context to what it is you're actually experiencing. So what if the closest amalgamation that Dante could think of to frozen space-time, because he has no concept of physics or space-time, is ice. And the devil is the point of fully expended energy. I always thought it was kind of odd that you had to go through and essentially crawl down the devil into the pit, go deeper which then goes to the mountain of purgatory, which will then take you to heaven. So, again, this point of pure potential and fully expended energy, they actually loop back on themselves. They act as a stationary frame of reference for us to identify good and bad through our subjective experience, like the old parallax effect in Disney movies, where in the hand-drawn Disney movies, they would have to create a zooming effect. Well, how do they do that? Because it's a 2D image. They would essentially create a background image, which the stationary object might be the moon, and then they would have a midground and a foreground, and they would move them at different rates closer to the camera, and this creates the illusion of depth and zooming in, with the stationary point acting as the frame of reference. So they're not just points at the end of a line, but they are looping back on themselves, like an electromagnetic or toroidal field, where they are a continuous cycle, a self-fulfilling cycle. This is the kind of meaning between, or not between, but for the quote from Revelations, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, who is, who was, and is to come, the Almighty. It's, I am everything that has ever been and will be, both the good and the bad, because good and bad are individual subjective experiences, and God is experiencing itself through individual expressions of consciousness, and we are God's children. And eventually, once this duality fully collapses, we no longer need to incarnate either at a certain level, or we can step outside the cycle of reincarnation altogether. So I hope you found this interesting, and be sure to join me in the next episode. If you want to know more, I have a course that I've made on Teachable. I will put that link in the description. And I'm also thinking of starting a Patreon. Be sure to give me some feedback in the comments and help with engagement, and I'll catch you in the next episode.